Let's dive in. So Karen and I will be presenting this morning about watershed characterization, understanding, and sharing your watershed story. So we'll talk today about frameworks for watershed characterization and planning. We'll define what a watershed characterization is and talk through motivations, project scope, outcome, people and process, and of course the product itself. And then we'll give an overview of the Watershed Characterization Pilot Project before we hand it over to Colleen Lutz and Larry Vail to talk about the case studies that we worked on with them. So a watershed plan, so starting from the planning process, provides a framework, a structure to plan for future conditions using a watershed framework and scale. So using that watershed delineation, using that integrated multidisciplinary approach to understanding the lands and the waters. People. Watershed plans traditionally have focused on water quality, but as I mentioned in the intro, they can also include other issues like flooding or habitat, ecology, environmental justice, and others. The Hudson River Watershed Plan actually focuses quite a lot on ecology as a focus area, just as an example. And it provides a process and a product that brings people together, builds consensus, and develops strategies. So watershed plans include a compilation of existing information and also specific actions to meet goals, which have been identified through the watershed planning process. Planning in general, regardless of what type of plan you're interested in, regardless of what the scope or scale, you want to understand current conditions, set goals for future conditions, and identify strategic actions to get from the present to the future. And again, whether you're looking at a natural resource inventory to an open space plan, a watershed plan, maybe a strategic plan, this is broadly the planning process. Broken down into more discrete steps, we need to define goals, which today we're really talking about motivations and approaches. So defining your motivation, delineating a watershed at the appropriate scale. So we know that watersheds can be delineated in all the kinds of different ways, convening partners, compiling existing data and information, identifying any gaps in that information where maybe we need to collect more information, prioritizing issues, creating targets, specifying actions, of course, implement the plan, that has an exclamation point, and also measuring progress and adapting if necessary. We know these types of planning approaches can be really iterative. That's why this graphic has a little loop-de-loop, because we often need to go back and kind of check in and see how it's going and what did we learn or what new projects have emerged. It's really a process that can be quite iterative. So today we're really focusing on this blue, characterize the watershed, but of course, we've got building partnerships as always important, really foundational to both the characterization and the plan. And this will help then set goals and identify solutions. So compiling existing data is really the heart of the watershed characterization process. And we can think about these steps together as the characterization itself. And these steps together, prioritizing, actions, implementation, as the plan. So setting those strategies, really working together to understand implementation priorities. In the state of New York, we have two different watershed frameworks, and there's a lot of different approaches that one can use, but we wanted to talk a little bit first about these broad frameworks so that if your train is going to get on the tracks, you can kind of figure out which station you're going to land at. Watershed characterization, spoiler alert, is central to both of these, and the kind of watershed characterization we're talking about really could be used for both planning frameworks. So the first one is what we call DOS watershed plans. In 2009, the Department of State and Department of Environmental Conservation published a guidebook on watershed plans, which provides a framework for watershed planning in New York State. These plans can be funded by Department of State watershed planning grants, which Brittany will be talking about. There you are. The other framework we call 9-element watershed plans. In 2008, the EPA wrote the Handbook for Developing Watershed Plans to Restore and Protect Our Waters. This is a framework for watershed planning across the whole country, which has been adapted by many states, including New York State, for use in our own state. And this is really the 9-element watershed planning process. And the distinction here, which Brittany will talk more about, includes the 9-element includes some specific pollutant reduction targets and modeling. That's not a part of, again, these DOS plans. That's going to be our shorthand for those two different frameworks. 9-element watershed plans can also be funded by Department of State watershed planning grants, which Brittany will also speak to. So when we look at the two frameworks side by side, there's so many similarities. Just a note, on the left is components, on the right is steps, but you can see that building partnerships, community outreach and participation, characterize the watershed, setting goals, implementation, and monitoring and tracking, all really important. But watershed characterization as a term, as a process, is really at the heart of both of these different frameworks. So understand current conditions is the focus of the watershed characterization process and product. It compiles existing information from all different sources together into one report to tell the watershed story. It supports an understanding of local conditions for decision-making and actions, and it provides a really important foundation for planning because it helps identify problems or gaps in information where maybe we don't know and we need some more information before identifying potential solutions. And this is really important because it's much easier to identify projects. Projects are really fun. You put the dots on the map, right? We'd love to have all these projects. And there's real value in doing projects. And sometimes it really helps to have the plan, the information, so we know we can prioritize, right? If we have limited resources, how can we have the project that implements our goals most efficiently, most effectively? And so that's where this can come in. And particularly with streams, we don't want to cause more problems if we're doing stream work. We really want to understand how these systems are working. So going back to our planning framework, understanding current conditions in the watershed characterization, and the watershed management plan sets the goals and identifies the strategic actions. And we can break this planning process up into smaller pieces that are hopefully a little bit more manageable, a little bit easier for everyone with all of the limited time, resources, capacity. So watershed characterization is the focus of today's workshop. And while it can be done with a big grant as part of a big watershed planning process, it also can be considered as a step on its own, as its own discrete project. It provides a place to start the project. Disparate information suddenly becomes easy to find, reference, and cite. We'll talk more about that. Right, Larry? It builds stronger cross-watershed relationships for future collaboration and can save time, money, and resources. So if you already have a watershed characterization, it will make the planning process a lot more streamlined. So can I do the slide while do you want to give the slide? Sure. This is our transition, but come on up, Karen. So the information that we're sharing today is guidance and not prescriptive. So in many cases, if you get a DOS grant, there's a specific work plan, there's specific steps. We want to be supporting you all and not necessarily telling you what to do, but supporting you as you make decisions and choose your own adventure. Great. Well,
and in that guidance and thinking about what you're doing as you're deciding to do a characterization for a plan, the process includes lots of hidden decisions that are best made local. And what I'm going to talk about is all those places where those decisions might come in that we'll work on more in the afternoon to help you make sure that you are doing the work that you want to be doing and going in the direction you want to be doing and not just following a recipe because it seems like the right next step to do. So really creating a characterization that's what your watershed would need, what's what your communities need. Because active decision making at the beginning of the process will help you have a more intentional planning process, better outcomes for you, your watershed, and your communities. So these decisions help inform both the process of doing the watershed characterization and the plan, if that comes later, as well as the product. Right? Got it? Yep, got it. Okay. So this is a list of some of the decisions that you will be making as you think about creating a watershed characterization, or if you're already working on one that you have already started to make. So one is the motivations. Why are you doing this? Where is it coming from? What do you need to explore? The focus of the work, some of the frameworks that Emily shared were really focused on water quality. And of course, that's a lot of the reason that people do watershed plans, but there's other reasons to do watershed plans as well. Thinking about geography too. The outcomes, what do you hope will happen as the result of doing this work? people and process. So when we think about watershed characterization or inventory, we often think about the technical data that we need to gather. I was trained as a biologist. I used to work with Ingrid on the conservation land use team. I love data. And also science doesn't conserve nature, people do. So you need to do the people part of the work. And this is a real opportunity to get folks engaged in the work because it's the people who are going to move it forward once they have good information to help them make decisions. Talk a little bit about some of the next steps you might consider after you have created a characterization, and then Emily's going to talk about the product. All right, so let's start with the motivation. This is a framework Emily and I learned from the River Network, working with some folks in Colorado. Let's not cover all the details, but that's okay. So 3 basic kinds of motivations. Reactionary. Something has happened and you want to understand it better. So there's a problem that's occurred and you want to know more about it or know what some of the causes are or the drivers of this problem, right? Anticipatory. A change is coming. Maybe there's a new development coming or concern about a dam removal. I don't know. There could be lots of climate change is certainly a change that's coming. So expecting a change coming and you want to create a baseline to understand what might be changing as this larger external change happens. And exploratory, right? You want to understand watershed conditions. Maybe you're just getting started. You want to know what's out there and you want to understand if there is a problem. Maybe that will help you, or maybe it's just a way to get started if your group is just forming, to know what's out there and to help you figure out what you want to do together. So that's your motivations. We're going to come back to reactionary, anticipatory, and exploratory later in the day. Then let's think about focus and scope. So geographic extent, right? There's a Hudson River Estuary Watershed. There's a bunch of sub-watersheds. Each of those sub-watersheds has smaller catchments, and you can decide to focus your effort on whichever scale makes sense. There's stream breach, stream management program, stream breach level, from the very small to the larger. So deciding that and being clear about what you want is a really important first step. And then the focus. What is it that you want to explore? There's a lot to explore. There's a lot of information out there about these watersheds. So understanding what you specifically want to explore will help you narrow down what you're looking for, which is because there's a lot of information out there. So if you know about watershed conditions or issues, maybe you want to think about sediment or flooding, or you are concerned about specific contaminants because they've been found in your water. Nutrients are an issue in many places. Blooms, for example. You're thinking about aquatic habitat and the fishery or the food chain. Others might focus a little bit more on the land and watershed restoration and the inputs to the water. Some groups focus on environmental justice more than others, and a lot of work is focused on climate and how that's affecting our land and our water and our people. So it can be very broad, or it can be narrow, depending on what it is that you want to focus on because it's what you were concerned about. All of these things, making decisions about these things can help you figure out what your timeline might be, how much it might cost you, which funding you might pursue, whether it's DOS or DEC or DOS for DOS or DEC. Figure that out, estuary program, private funding, that kind of thing. And it also help you figure out what expertise and experience you need as you're building out your team to help find this information or analyze the information. So trying to make some decisions about what you're focused on early on can be really helpful in making this more useful for you and your community. Next, think about what you want to do as a result, like how this characterization is going to serve you. Or we're talking about locally led, and so that could be watershed groups or municipalities, sometimes nonprofits working in service of them. It can be a really important source of institutional memory for small groups that are often all volunteer. Sometimes a lot of things are in one person's brain, and you get to, when you write it all down or type it all up, then you're able to share that information with more people, which is a very helpful thing because people don't live forever. And they can help build local capacity because you now understand what information you have and where it is and how to get it. So even if you don't understand every single piece of the data or every single part of the report, when you're seeking out experts, you know a lot more than you did before, right? So you can at least point them in the right direction. So that's part of where it can save you money. So you're not hiring people to find the information for you. It can increase the legitimacy of the work because in the process that you're doing, right, you should be reaching out to people because you'll be asking for some information that they might have. It's also a great opportunity, we'll talk about this in a bit, to engage people and the public and local stakeholders in what you're doing and why, and helping them see that you are serious and that you are providing scientific information as well as engaging people effectively. So that can help increase legitimacy of the work. As Ingrid mentioned, it can also help support other local plans, practices, and procedures because some of the information is similar to what is in a natural resource inventory and of course specific to water. And then as we've discussed already, that characterization can also lead into a plan and really get you kickstarted on that. And I wondered if really.
Yeah. I think that it also, in terms of building local capacity, it can be so helpful to have all of your information and the story of your watershed in one place to get more people involved. So I know a lot of groups are trying to recruit more people and you get someone new to the group and they're like, what do I need to know? And you're like, and you can give them the watershed characterization as a way to get that information sort of downloaded and get them up to speed more quickly. I find as a regional partner too, if there's a new watershed that I'm just getting to know, if there is a past characterization or plan, it's so much easier for me to figure out where I can plug in. So again, as we're thinking about local engagement, regional partnerships, I think that this can be a really significant tool in and of itself. All right.
Okay, thinking about people and process. So who might you get involved? You might want some paid or volunteer experts that have specific skills that you need to help maybe have access to information or they can understand and help you interpret it. Folks who have an interest in implementing the characterization or a plan down the line. Local and regional partners, there's a lot of those folks in the room today. Many of whom are interested in supporting watershed characterizations or plans. So find out who they are and talk to them if you haven't already. People who can provide context about the work. Maybe that's folks that are working with soil and water, so they know about projects that have been done or resources, or maybe it's someone who's lived in the watershed a long time and knows the history, or maybe it's someone who knows the communities really well. There's a lot of people who can provide context that's not necessarily technical information. We'll talk about that more this afternoon. Similarly, people conducted in different constituencies, especially folks that are harder to reach because they have not necessarily been part of past planning efforts because they don't show up when we say, hey, let's have a meeting. Don't you want to learn about watershed planning? Learning how to go to them and make your work more relevant to their work and listen effectively to what issues are relevant to those folks. And then thinking about the broader public, people who might be affected by implementing, thinking about planning down the road, or riparian landowners that are living along the stream or water body, getting that information out a little bit more broadly. So there's a lot of different kinds of people you might want to involve in the process in different ways. So some of those ways, you'll want a project lead or a project champion, which we'll talk a little bit more about with Colleen and Larry, an advisory committee of some kind, like a small group of people to help you focus the work and direct consultants or help get it done. Key constituencies, people to keep informed. That might be your local and regional partners who are not on the advisory committee, or your municipal officials, or people who have access to other kinds of information or funding that they're not serving on the committee, but you really want to make sure in that inner mid-ring circle, right? Kind of like they want to have more information than general public so that that can help you move this process forward when it's done, or with this project forward when it's complete. And then, of course, community engagement and outreach. And I always use engagement and not just outreach or public participation. Engagement implies two-way interactions, right? So you're not just telling people all the things, you're listening to them because they have information that's important and relevant, and it might change the way you do things, and that isn't a bad thing. That's a useful thing because we want what watershed planning, watershed implementation, protecting our water is going to be so much more effective if more people are part of those efforts, and we help people become part of the efforts by listening to them and taking their concerns seriously and including them in our work. All right, some more next steps, which Emily alluded to before, thinking about, these are not so much outcomes, but next steps and how you can use them. That's okay. It's really important because it's a tool to help tell the watershed story. And as you'll hear from Colleen and Larry, maybe the actual document might not be so friendly to share because they can be long. But you have the material which you can take and then summarize the work, or as you both did, right, share the maps out at different events. Maps are really engaging for a lot of people, especially the maps that were made for the Sparkhill and Brook conversation and discussion and questions. Certainly onboarding material for watershed group members and making sure that folks understand what, the current conditions of the watershed and where they can fit into the process, as well as, group members, as well as some of those potential regional partners. Sharing them with local officials to use in local planning, and then using community presentations to share information about the project, gather feedback, depending on where you are in the process, identify next steps, like have community help you figure out what to do next. And also, extremely importantly, building additional support, because it's, again, the people who are doing the work, who understand what you're doing and why, the more likely you're going to be able to move this project forward as a plan or beyond. I think. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Karen.
All of that is the process. And I think when we think about a watershed characterization or a plan, we think about the PDF or the printed document, which Colleen did bring a copy of the punch book. So if you do want to flip through, it's out on the table in the hall. Take a look during our next coffee break. But the process really informs the product. And we really wanted to lay that foundation first. So what we get asked all the time is, what information goes into a watershed characterization? How do I know what goes into it? And so the outline that we use that might also be helpful for you is to make sure there's an introduction that has background on the process, the goals. It sort of lays out a lot of the decisions that we made, physical characteristics of the watershed, things like the geology, the climate, lands of the watershed, land use, forests, wetlands, terrestrial habitats, and really importantly, the built environment. That's quite a big section of these. Waters of the watershed really focuses on the water bodies, floodplains, aquatic habitats, water quality, and water infrastructure, and the people of the watershed who are living in and caring for the watershed. So this gave us an opportunity to include environmental justice, demographics, but also the watershed groups that are really actively working to protect these watersheds. So the product of a characterization can take many different forms. It can be a PDF report. The State of the Sawmill River Watershed is a really nice example back from 2019. It's something like a report card could be a watershed characterization. Maybe it's a story map, like the beautiful Pecanico River Watershed characterization that Pace developed. Bard College and the Saukville Watershed Community just released this amazing online database that has a built-in web mapper that compiles all kinds of information, and then you can use it to build your own maps and charts, and it's remarkable. I want to say too that a watershed characterization can also be like a presentation, like an event where maybe you have posters of all the different things and you bring the people together, or maybe you have 15 to 20-minute talks on each of the different chapters and kind of shares it out that way. So it can be like a event-based form too. It doesn't have to be just a hold, but there's value in that too, depending on what your goals are. Where to get information. So of course, the right information depends on the project focus and scope. we found that it can be very helpful to start with broadly accessible information and mappers, like the DEC Info Locator, the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. The U.S. Geological Survey has a program called Stream Stats. And this can be helpful as a starting point to kind of get to know what's out there and what the watershed is like, before then compiling relevant reports, data, and information, which is often more local, could be regional, maybe academic, things like water quality monitoring results, municipal plans. There's been habitat studies, academic monitoring or research, all of that kind of information. This is a picture of the Sparkill stream stats with some remediation sites that were really useful in creating that plan, that characterization. So next, I'm going to talk through some of the process highlights from our watershed characterization pilot project, but really Colleen and Larry are going to talk more specifically about this. So with support from the Hudson River Estuary Program and NUIPIC between 2022 and 2024, the Hudson River Watershed Alliance did a pilot project in 2 small watersheds to develop guidance materials and share lessons learned regionally. That was the Punch Brook Roll-Off Jansenkill watershed, which is our rural case study, and the Sparkill Creek watershed, which is our urban case study. And you'll see maps from both of these, just how different the land use is. That's actually this slide, just how different the land use is. So really, Punch Brook is mostly in Columbia County with a little bit in Dutchess County. The Sparkill Creek watershed is mostly in Rockland County with a little bit in New Jersey. And you can see all of the agriculture, that's the yellow, and the forest cover, that's the green in the Punch Brook, compared to the much more built out development, which are those different red colors in the Sparkill Creek watershed. We wanted to have an example of the full sort of spectrum of land use because we know that different data are available in different kinds of watersheds. So we wanted to make sure we mapped the agriculture of the Punch Brook, but there is not much agriculture in the Sparkill. We wanted to make sure we mapped the stormwater infrastructure of the Sparkill. Again, these are templates for others to use. So we wanted to make sure we had as many different types of information represented. So our process broadly was to organize a watershed advisory committee, delineate the focus watershed, gather existing information, and summarize the information into a report. And our timeline was about 2 years working with each of these groups. Karen talked about all the different roles. I wanted to highlight some of the roles here. I was the project manager and facilitated the meeting. So that was the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. We had a local champion and point person, which was Colleen Lutz in the Punch Brook Roll-Off Jansenkill and Larry Vail in the Sparkill. They helped us really communicate with the advisory committee, make sure we got local information, kept everything really grounded in local priorities. We had an advisory committee in each watershed with local and regional representatives. In terms of writing and organizing the information, that was the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, Karen from Strong Outcomes, with some support from Tracy Letter, who was on our board at the time. We had a secondary data quality assurance project plan that we used because it was required. That is not required by many of the fundings for watershed plans in the state, but if you ever need a secondary data we have one. Don't reinvent the wheel, use ours. Thanks, Tracy, for helping us work through it. And then the mapping, we got a lot of questions about the maps that are in the hallway here. That was done by Adirondack Research, which is now called Green Goat Maps, with a lot of support from Kate Meyer-Dirks from Siena College. Thank you, Kate. And of course, funding from NUIPIC and the Hudson River Estuary Program, who are also on the advisory committee. So when we got started with the advisory committee, one of the first things we asked was, how do you want to use the watershed characterization? Is this an educational tool that we would write in plain language and keep really streamlined? Is this a compilation of information that we would maybe not keep so streamlined? Is this a tool to build local support? And we had these surveys that we asked each of the groups to really inform the process and product. So this was one from the Sparkill, and I don't know if you can see this, but compiling all available information in one place was the #1 priority. And this was not that we don't want to communicate in a user-friendly way, but that wasn't the focus of this project. That wasn't the primary goal. And that really informed how we developed this characterization. Then we had to delineate the watershed, which seems simple, right? It's a topography, like how hard could that be? But there's some of them laugh because there was a lot of decision making here. And so for the Punch Brook Roll-Off Jansenkill, we had to decide, is this a Huck 12 watershed, which we're not going to talk about HUCs today, but that's one framework that you can use. Is this the tributary watershed itself? For the Sparkill, so we ended up going with the HUC 12 for Punch Brook, but it was a conversation that we had. For the Sparkill, we used a delineation from a previous plan that had just been completed. So if you're delineating a stream, you may know if you're 1 pixel off, the watershed might be different. And for such a small watershed, we wanted to make sure that we were in line with previous planning efforts, particularly for how much the Piermont Marsh was included, which is very flat. And yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Yes, exactly. So we use the Resilient New York flood study delineation to be consistent. Then we compiled federal, state, publicly accessible regional data sets for the first draft of reports and map, which really helped us set our table of contents and structure. And then we compiled locally available reports data information for the report and where possible, the map. So the maps are primarily that sort of federal state information, but we were able to add some local data sets. Like this map includes the stormwater outfalls that were mapped by the local MS4 programs. So what information to include? Challenging to know with a very holistic sort of exploratory approach. So we used a decision framework. Is this information from within the focused watershed? Sometimes it was from just outside. We didn't use that. Does it inform an understanding of current watershed conditions? Are there specific details about data collection and methodology? So some quality questions. And then how will the information be used in the watershed characterization? Does this show up in the narrative? Is it in a map? Table? Is it reference only, or is it something else? And I had to put this picture of the creeks, brooks, and rivers in Rockland County, New York, and their relation to planning for the future from 1963, written by the U.S. Geological Survey. I think this was our oldest document included in either of the characterizations. So does it inform an understanding of current watershed conditions? It's fascinating. I read it. And I think that sometimes there's also these historical baselines, but because in the Sparkill, it was so important to compile all that information and maintain that institutional knowledge, this was reference only. So this was cited. It's very fascinating. We don't want to lose track of it, but it's not necessarily, it's from 1963. It's not going to inform necessarily current decision making, but helps provide that historical baseline. So every source was entered into a spreadsheet, filed in Google Drive, linked within the report. This is a photo from the Sparkill Creek watershed. We had 66 data sets for the maps, 93 data sources for the reports. There's just a ton of information. It's the smallest, best studied watershed out there. There's a couple other really well studied, but that's maybe number one. So we completed the watershed characterization report with the narratives, maps, and a little bit of interpretation. Could have done more. And with feedback from the advisory committee throughout, which really helped ground in local priorities, and also to fact check to make sure that the information was correct. That was a really important part of this process. And then had a community presentation to share out the projects, gather feedback, and help collect some priorities for next steps. Just a quick word on the maps. They provide really important illustrations of watershed conditions. This was another area of decision making for us. So we used maps as images within the report rather than using web maps. And we wanted to make some decisions around the extent, layers, and stories to emphasize. Web mapping tools are really great, but it can also be overwhelming and it doesn't tell necessarily one story. You have to click the layers on and off, you have to zoom in and out. And we wanted it to be really clear as an illustration of those current watershed conditions. We have links in the report to relevant web maps like the Natural Resource Mapper, like the DEC Info Locator, but really wanted to use the maps to connect people to the watershed and start conversations, which they've been really successful in doing. Maps must be accurate, customized, and thoughtfully designed, both with and for communities. We got a lot of feedback from our advisory committees in the cartography to make sure it really made sense to people, that it landed. And we think the mapping in particular is a great opportunity to partner with academics and students to develop maps. And Kate Myers from Siena College just published a journal article with a case study of a summer collaboration with the Fishkill Creek Watershed Alliance, the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, and Siena College with some best practices on those win-win student community collaboration opportunities, which can also save a lot of time and budget, hopefully, but also really help students with real life professional experience and help get communities great maps. So what's next for us is that we The watershed characterization pilot project reports and process are all on our website. They're available for templates. Please use them, take a look. We are also working on publishing a watershed characterization guidance document later this spring, which will have much more details on frameworks, process, lessons learned, research on best practices, partnering with students, data and information checklists so you can find the stuff you need, links to more information, and we're really excited about 2 upcoming watershed characterization projects that we'll be a partner on for the Fishkill Creek and Black Creek watersheds. So that's it from us, and I know we're over time, so maybe we can take a question or 2, but we have much more time for Q&A after other presenters.
That one.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know the focus here is on getting one built. Is there any thought on the maintenance and ongoing process around it? Like, I think there are, as you said, there was one in 63. There's, he's got one from 20 years ago, right? But the minute the ink is dry, it's age. So are there iterative processes to do like incremental characterizations over time, or is that something you might be looking at in the future? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a lot of you, when you registered, said I have a watershed characterization or plan, but it needs to be updated. So that's part of this iterative nature of this. I think some of the information, like the geology, is maybe not going to change, where new water quality data might be collected every season and can be really active. So there might be places where more updated information can be housed on a website, or maybe there's a way to keep things a little bit more temporally up to date. And I think a lot of watershed plans have really good projects, baseline information, and can be useful. So it's not to say, after 15 to 20 years, it's no longer useful. I think there's a lot of real evergreen information, but it's about keeping it fresh. And that's a lot of where some of the people come in and making sure that the Fishkill Creek Watershed Alliance, I know, Brent, you're working with the 8-year-old Fishkill Watershed Plan and making sure at every meeting, go through a chapter and make sure people kind of know what's already been done. And we can compare 20 years as a baseline to current day conditions. I think that's a great example of a way to keep that body of work that's so significant really useful. There may also be components that get updated. The Bronx River Alliance just updated their watershed management plan. It didn't include anything on environmental justice or climate change when it was published 20 years ago. And so they created a whole new plan that really incorporates those in as well. So there's a lot of different options depending on the scale, the goals, priority to keep these things useful over time.
The follow-up, Emily, to Jim's question. Are there best practices somewhere for what change might tip off an update? I'm just thinking if these are volunteer groups who are doing this, you could do this every year, and maybe you're like, should we do it every year? Should we do it every 6 months, every season when we do more testing? For example, new development or some novel entity in the water when we tested it this year, or clear cutting or something like that. Are there best practices for what and when to make that?
Yeah, there's not that I know of, but I would say that we've been doing a lot of capacity building work with watershed groups in parallel to this work and working on work plans. And I think that's where other planning frameworks might be helpful to say, okay, we just learned something. So how does this impact the watershed group? Or if you have a watershed plan implementation committee of some kind, how does this reprioritize what our efforts are for the year? So you might need to do a whole rewrite of the watershed plan, or it might be we need a sub-watershed scale or a reach scale. There's a site design that needs to be done to help inform that. Or the watershed group needs to reprioritize what we'll work on in a work plan this year. So I think there's a lot of different tools depending on the need.